The champagne glass slipped from her hand. My 10-year-old son stood at his birthday party, looked his stepfather in the eyes, and pressed play. I watched a grown man's face drain of colour. The crystal shattered against the weathered wood of my restoration dock, shards skittering across the planks. That was the last afternoon they would ever speak to me like I was under their control. If you were standing there, watching the people who constantly belittled you lose their power to a child's honesty, would you have saved them or let the tape play? Rewind a few hours, my boat restoration workshop sits on the edge of the harbour, smelling of rich cedar, epoxy, and the sharp tang of salt water. It is not a glamorous place. The floor is stained with years of varnish, and the tools on the pegboard belong to my grandfather. But it is mine, and it is the place Mason loves most. Chloe and Gregory arrived in a pristine $150,000 European sports car, the tires crunching loudly over the crushed oyster shells in the driveway. The doors swung open, and they stepped out, immediately taking up too much physical and psychological space. Gregory carried a small designer travel cooler, popping a bottle of vintage champagne and pouring it into 2 crystal flutes they'd brought from home. It was a calculated move their way of marking this rustic territory with their own expensive brand of comfort, as if the local air wasn't quite pure enough for them to breathe without a buffer. Chloe was wearing a linen sundress that cost more than my monthly overhead, her expensive floral perfume clashing violently with the smell of sawdust. Gregory wore tailored slacks and a linen button-down. He looked around my workshop with the amused, detached curiosity of a tourist visiting a petting zoo. Well, Chloe said, her voice carrying over the sound of the gulls, "This is certainly rustic. Are we sure it is safe for the kids?" I did not answer. I was busy adjusting the projector screen against the far wall. Mason's 5th grade hero project was supposed to be the highlight of the afternoon, and I wanted it to be perfect. "It is fine, Chloe," Gregory said, patting her shoulder with practiced condescension. "It builds character." I kept my hands busy with the extension cords. I did not snap. I did not ask them to leave. The hardest part of divorce is not the separation. It is the forced proximity to someone who now views you as an opponent, waiting for you to make a mistake. In family court, a father's justified anger is almost always weaponized as unstable aggression. Silence was my only tactical shield. "Mason's out back," I said calmly, not looking up. "The food will be ready in 20 minutes. I thought the worst part of the day would be swallowing my pride. I had no idea Chloe was about to try and buy my son's entire future right in front of me. I spent 60 hours a week sanding hulls. That was the math of my existence. After the divorce, my life became an endless calculation of sweat equity. I took on extra restoration commissions, breathing in fiberglass dust until my lungs ached, just to ensure Mason's life with me did not feel like a downgrade. Chloe had married into corporate wealth, trading our shared history for Gregory's black card. The contrast was impossible to ignore, especially on days like today. Across the dock, I watched Gregory hand Mason a brand new top-of-the-line drone. The kid's eyes went wide. It was the kind of extravagant gift you give when you want to buy affection rather than earn it. If I am being honest, there was a dark, quiet part of me that wondered if my time was enough. I could not buy Mason the world. Instead, I taught him how to read tide charts. I showed him how to mix epoxy, how to measure twice and cut once, how to build things that would not fall apart when the weather turned. But when you are a working class father sharing custody with a millionaire, the insecurity is a heavy anchor. You constantly wonder if a 10-year-old boy will eventually prefer the man who writes the checks over the man who works with his hands. Gregory walked over to the beverage cooler, casually adjusting his expensive watch. He looked at my hands, which were permanently stained with wood filler and engine grease. "Must be nice, Elijah," Gregory said, a polite smile plastered on his face. "Working a hobby job, no real corporate pressure. Chloe and I were just saying how peaceful it must be to live so simply." It was a calculated insult wrapped in the guise of friendly conversation. A few years ago, I might have dropped my tools and told him exactly where to shove that comment, but I did not. I just kept wiping down the projector table. People often ask why I tolerated their disrespect for so long. They do not understand the trap of normalized cruelty when you are co-parenting with someone obsessed with status. You learn very quickly that your reactions are being monitored, recorded, and curated. In the cold calculus of family court, the rules are rigidly defined. If a mother raises her voice, she is fiercely protective. If a father raises his voice, he is deemed unstable and aggressive. I had spent years conditioning myself to swallow my pride because my anger was the exact currency Chloe needed to build her legal case against me. Every insult I absorbed without reacting was another day I got to keep my son. My silence was not submission. It was a tactical shield. I let them think I was weak because correcting them was not worth risking my custody time. I nodded at Gregory, offering him nothing but a flat, empty stare, and went back to setting up the folding chairs. I was so focused on being the steady foundation that I did not see the wrecking ball Chloe was swinging until it was already in motion. About an hour into the party, the crowd had settled. People were eating burgers, laughing by the cooler, the kids running wild across the grassy patch behind the workshop. That was when Chloe made her move. She walked over to the folding table holding the birthday cake, picked up a silver spoon, and clinked it against her glass of champagne. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient noise like a warning bell. "If I could just have everyone's attention for a brief moment," Chloe announced, her voice perfectly modulated to project across the dock. The chatter died down. The local boat rides, the guys who ran the tackle shop down the street, the parents from Mason's school, everyone turned to look. They shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of this woman holding court in my workshop. Since we are all here celebrating Mason turning 10, Gregory and I wanted to share a very special gift, Chloe said, flashing a brilliant practice smile. An investment in his future. Gregory stepped forward, placing a manicured hand heavily on Mason's shoulder. I saw Mason stiffen, his small frame tensing under the weight of the gesture, but Gregory did not notice. Or, if he did not care. "As you all know, education is everything," Chloe continued. She looked directly at me then, her eyes locking onto mine with chilling precision. "Which is why Gregory has secured a spot for Mason at the Oak Ridge Academy starting this fall. He has already taken care of the first year's tuition, $40,000, paid in full." The workshop went dead silent. The only sound was the water lapping against the wooden pilings outside and the distant cry of a gull. Looking back now, I have to admire the cold, clinical efficiency of the maneuver. This was not an announcement, it was a hostile takeover disguised as a charitable donation. She was leveraging a checkbook to initiate a public buyout of my parental rights. An out-of-state boarding school meant Mason would be gone. It meant my custody arrangement would be reduced to holiday visits and scheduled phone calls, managed entirely by her. Legally, our custody agreement required my signature for any change in his education. But Chloe wasn't looking for consent. She was creating a fait accompli. She bet that by throwing $40,000 at a prestigious name, she could paint my refusal as a bitter attempt to sabotage our son's future in the eyes of the court. I stood frozen behind the folding table, a stack of paper plates in my hand. The psychological trap was perfectly engineered. If I raised my voice, if I told him to get off my property, I instantly became the bitter, unstable ex-husband trying to deny his own son a world-class education out of pure jealousy. My anger would be packaged, documented, and presented to a judge within the week as proof that I was unfit to prioritize my child's needs. But if I stayed quiet, I surrendered my son. I caught the eye of my lead carpenter, a man who had known me for 2 decades. He looked ready to throw Gregory into the harbor. I gave him a fraction of a head shake. "Stand down." At the time, I did not realize how much weight a child can carry until they decide to set it down. I looked over at Mason. He was not looking at the expensive drone Gregory had just given him. He was not looking at his mother. His small, sawdust-dusted fingers were tightly gripping a plastic thumb drive. He kept glancing between Chloe's triumphant, smiling face and the blank projector screen I had set up earlier for his school presentation. She smiled at me from across the room, waiting for me to crack. But Mason stepped up to the projector before I could say a single word. The screen flickered to life against the back wall. What Chloe had not noticed was Mason quietly stepping away from Gregory's heavy hand on his shoulder. My son had walked over to my laptop resting on the workbench and clicked the mouse. Before I could intervene, a burst of static-filled, royalty-free stock music echoed through the workshop. I reached for the laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to stop him not to protect Chloe, but to protect Mason from the fallout of his own honesty. But the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't a look of revenge, it was a plea to finally be heard. The title card popped up in bright, clashing colors. It read, "My hero," with an accent mark floating awkwardly over the letter E. It was his school project. It was not a polished production. It was clumsy 10-year-old editing. The transitions were jarring star wipes and the audio levels spiked unpredictably. But the content was ruthless in its absolute innocence. The first half was a digital scrapbook of Gregory's version of fatherhood. It was not malicious, it was just factual. A photograph appeared of a highly expensive electric scooter sitting untouched in a pristine, perfectly vacuumed living room. Then, a wide, shaky shot of a Little League bleacher on a Tuesday evening. Chloe was sitting there, looking at her phone, with an empty aluminum bench seat beside her. Next was a brief video of Gregory holding up one manicured finger to Mason, pacing away down a paved driveway to take a business call. Looking back now, I realize something fundamental about children. We spend our adult lives assuming we successfully mask our absences behind bank transfers and busy schedules. We think money provides an adequate alibi for not showing up. But kids do not audit our finances. They audit our time. They see exactly what we value by where we place our physical presence. The screen executed a jagged fade to black. When the image returned, the audio switched to the rhythmic, abrasive sound of sandpaper on wood. It was footage Mason had secretly taken on his phone. Mason had spent the last year carrying his old phone everywhere, filming vlogs that I assumed were just about seagulls and boat scraps. I never realized he was documenting the gaps in his own life, capturing the moments where the people who claimed to love him simply forgot he was in the room. It showed me coated in a thick layer of white fiberglass dust, wiping sweat off my forehead with the back of a greasy wrist. The camera bobbed wildly as Mason's voice asked from behind the lens, "Dad, how do you know when it is done?" My voice, muffled from behind a respirator mask, answered through the cheap laptop speakers. When you run your hand over the surface and you cannot feel the brakes anymore. More clips followed, me standing in the freezing coastal rain, helping him untangle a stubborn fishing line. Me sitting right here on this dock, eating a cold turkey sandwich while tracing a finger over his math homework. The final slide faded in. The text was simple, typed in plain black letters over a white background. Mason's voice, quiet and completely sincere, delivered the voiceover. A hero does not buy you things. A hero helps you build them. The video ended, dropping the screen back to a stark, blinding black. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the entire workshop was the low, steady hum of the projector fan cooling its bulb. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The silence was absolute, heavier and more suffocating than any argument could have been. And that is when the champagne glass hit the floor. It slipped from Chloe's hand, shattering against the weathered cedar planks. The sound echoed like a gunshot, breaking the spell. Gregory's face had drained of all color. The polished, untouchable corporate executive was gone, replaced by a man publicly stripped of his carefully curated savior persona. He looked around the room, but no one met his eye. The workshop didn't erupt in boos. It simply went cold. The local boatwrights and parents didn't move, but their collective gaze shifted not with anger, but with a sudden, devastating clarity. It was the look you give a beautiful house when you realize the foundation is rotted through. Chloe tried to recover. She offered a tight, brittle laugh that died almost immediately. "Well, that was a very creative project, Mason," she managed, her voice trembling. Acute misunderstanding of how things work. Nobody bought it. The crowd's silence was a wall she could not charm her way through. There was no screaming match, no dramatic speeches or declarations of victory. That is the reality of social humiliation. It does not end in a fiery explosion, but in a quiet, agonizing retreat. Gregory muttered something under his breath and turned toward the door. Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second before following him, leaving without saying goodbye to the son whose future she had just tried to buy. Through the open workshop doors, I watched them walk to their car. Gregory's hands were shaking so badly he fumbled with the keys to the $80,000 sports car, struggling to unlock the door in his panic. That is the power illusion of an empty wallet. When your authority and your worth are entirely rented through your bank account, you are incredibly fragile. Mason's video had not attacked their finances, it had exposed their emotional bankruptcy. And once a child strips away that financial veneer, revealing the hollow reality beneath, people like Gregory and Chloe have no intrinsic value left to stand on. They become paper tigers in a rainstorm. I did not gloat. I did not follow them out. I simply turned, wrapped my arms tightly around my son, and picked up the knife to start cutting the birthday cake. They drove away in their luxury car, but I knew the real battle was just moving from my dock to a courtroom. Family court is not a lightning strike. It is a slow, terrifying glacier that moves with a grinding inevitability, threatening to crush everything in its path. Chloe did not apologize after the disastrous birthday party. She retaliated, humiliated in front of the local community. She filed an aggressive motion to restrict my custody and force the boarding school enrollment. Her legal filing claimed I had psychologically manipulated Mason into creating the video to deliberately sabotage her new marriage. There was no overnight victory. There was no cinematic courtroom confession where the antagonist breaks down and surrenders. The reality of fighting a well-funded ex-spouse is a grueling, exhausting war of attrition. In this county, these battles usually drag on for years, but the judge was visibly disturbed by Chloe's attempt to relocate Mason without a single signature from me. She granted an expedited schedule to resolve the emergency of his enrollment, yet even with a faster clock, the weight of the process felt eternal. The next 8 months were the hardest of my life. I nearly went into ruinous debt paying my attorney. I sold the vintage 1950s heritage skiff I had spent 5 years restoring for myself, the only piece of history I truly owned, just to cover the initial retainer. My friends at the harbour, the guys who knew the grit behind my work, started prepaying for their spring hull repairs months in advance, effectively crowdsourcing my legal defense because they couldn't stand. Every spare dollar from the boat shop went straight into a legal retainer account. I stopped sleeping. I lost 15 pounds. I spent countless hours compiling text messages, emails, and receipts, building an undeniable paper trail to prove I was the one consistently showing up, while she was attempting a hostile buyout of our son's life. My attorney saw the evidence Mason had captured and knew we had more than a chance we had the truth. He agreed to a deferred payment plan, betting on the strength of our documentation rather than the size of my bank account. He knew that in a court of equity, $1 million check couldn't erase 1,000 hours of documented absence. If I am being honest, there were nights I sat alone in the dark, staring at my calloused hands, wondering if I would have to sell the workshop just to keep fighting. Chloe used every expensive legal tactic available. She delayed hearings, requested endless continuances, and buried my lawyer in frivolous paperwork designed entirely to bankrupt me. I had to sit in those mandatory mediation rooms, breathing in the sterile, fluorescent lit air that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. It was a sharp, suffocating contrast to the rich cedar and open saltwater breeze of my boat dock. Sitting across the table from Chloe and her high-priced legal team, I kept my expression completely neutral, swallowing down the quiet panic that her checkbook might actually win. But the video incident at the party triggered one crucial procedural step: a court-appointed psychological evaluation for Mason. The evaluator was a quiet, observant woman with a legal pad and tired eyes. She spoke privately with my son over the course of several weeks. I do not know exactly what he told her. I never asked him. I did not want to coach him or contaminate his truth. But her final report confirmed everything that his clumsy 10-year-old video had exposed to our neighbors. She thoroughly documented the emotional neglect in Chloe's household. She noted the performative, shallow nature of Gregory's parenting and highlighted the stark reality that Mason felt safe, valued, and prioritized only when he was with me. The minor child, the official report read, demonstrates a clear, documented attachment to his father's consistent presence, which stands in sharp contrast to the mother's reliance on financial substitution. That single clinical sentence changed the trajectory of the entire case. Chloe's leverage evaporated the moment an impartial professional put her emotional bankruptcy on the public record. Justice in family court is not a lightning strike, it is a glacier. But eventually the ice breaks. They kept their checkbook, I kept my son. The mediation concluded on a Tuesday morning, finalized not with a dramatic courtroom speech, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on triplicate carbon paper. Primary physical custody was officially awarded to me. Mason would remain in his local school, securely anchored to the life we had built on the coast. Chloe retained every other weekend visitation. That is the clinical reality of the legal system. You do not banish an antagonist from the earth. You simply restrict their access and legally enforce the boundaries they refuse to respect. The social humiliation from the birthday party, compounded by the financial and emotional drain of an 8-month legal slog, fractured Chloe and Gregory's marriage. It did not explode in a cinematic confrontation. It simply eroded under the weight of its own performative maintenance. They quietly filed for separation before the year ended. Gregory's corporate wealth allowed him to buy his way out of the relationship, but it could not buy back his pristine public image. He faded from our lives, an expensive liability Chloe would have to audit on her own. Back at the dock, the air smelled heavily of salt and fresh epoxy. Mason and I had spent the last 12 months restoring a small wooden skiff, working on it during the quiet hours after his homework was done. We finally carried it down the ramp, the smooth cedar hull slipping easily into the freezing coastal water. I watched my son grip the oars, his hands coated in a fine layer of sawdust, his face split into a genuine, uncurated smile. It took me years to understand the actual mechanics of fatherhood. I used to believe I was operating at a deficit because I could not match the financial capital of a corporate developer. I viewed my calloused hands and 60-hour work weeks as a distinct disadvantage in a rigged market. If I am being honest, there were nights I felt like a failing investor in my own life, terrified of a hostile takeover, but providing for a child is not a financial transaction. Gregory thought he could outsource his fatherhood the same way he outsourced his landscaping, expecting a high yield on a zero-effort investment. Children, however, do not accept liquid assets in exchange for emotional security. They operate on a completely different standard of currency, time, consistency, and dirt under the fingernails. I did not have to destroy my ex-wife to protect my son. I did not have to scream or threaten or engage in a public war of attrition. Some things do not break all at once. They erode. And sometimes the best way to win a war is not to fight it, is simply to build a foundation so solid that nobody can drag you away from it. I let Chloe's arrogance bankrupt her own authority, and I just stood steady long enough for the truth to reveal itself. We live in a society that constantly insists we must purchase our value. Have you ever found yourself trying to outwork someone else's wallet, only to realize your quiet, consistent presence was the only currency that actually mattered? If this reality resonates with your own life experience, I would truly like to hear your perspective.